Hello everybody and welcome to another video, and today we're going to be looking at the newest track by Ghosts of Atlantis. Now, I've covered Ghosts of Atlantis quite extensively in the past. It's been a while since I last looked at them, I believe, but a little while ago they released a new track called Melkin's Tale. The actual song itself was released a little while ago, but they've only recently released the actual video for it, if I'm remembering correctly. You know, the actual song itself has been floating around on YouTube, but it's only fairly recently that they added the actual video for the track. Anyway, in the past, like I said, we've looked at Ghosts of Atlantis, and you know, most of their albums have been concept albums, you know, talking about sort of like folklore and, you know, sort of those sorts of tales, you know, like covering Atlantis, for example. Now, like I said, the newest track is called Melkin's Tale. Now, I had to look up what this might mean, and I found something called The Prophecy of Melkin, which is a medieval text about an alleged hidden grave of Joseph of Arimathea at Glastonbury in England, containing the Holy Grail. It is contained in a local chronicle, the Chronica Sive Antiquates Glastonensis Ecclesiae, written by John of Glastonbury in the mid-14th century, who attributes it to an alleged Celtic bard named Melkin, said to have lived before Merlin. It is thought to have been created in the context of legends that linked Joseph of Arimathea to the mythical Avalon, Glastonbury, and the court of King Arthur, which had arisen in England in the sort of mid-13th century. Now, the legend itself may have been partly based on an older narrative of how the discovery of the alleged grave of King Arthur at Glastonbury had been foretold by an ancient Welsh bard mentioned by Gerald of Wales around 1193. Later references to Melkin are found in a chronicle of John Harding in the mid-15th century and in writings of John Leyland in the 16th century. Leyland claims that Melkin was a famous erudite ancient British writer and bard of Welsh origin, and that he was the author of a History of Britain, or Historia Laribus Britannicus, of which Leyland had seen ancient fragments in Glastonbury. Other 16th and century writers include such as John Bell and John Pitts, placed Melkin in the mid-6th century, the time associated with King Arthur. It has been conjectured that the name Melkin may have been based on the 6th century Welsh king Maelgwyn of Gwynedd, I pronounced that horribly, I'm sure, who also had a reputation of a bard and a prophet. Now, there is the text here of the Latin prophecy, but I'm not going to read through that. I mean, it's fairly short, but I mean, you can actually look up the text if you want to. So, you know, this is again based on folklore and legends, as have much of their other pieces of music. So I'm quite interested to see what they've done with this. And, you know, like I said, Ghosts of Atlantis are a brilliant band. You know, they've had brilliant performances. I've covered quite a few of their videos in the past, and they've always been quite enjoyable. And, you know, I normally read through the lyrics of a song to look at the themes, the morals and meanings. Obviously, this song is based on, like, legends and folklore, that sort of thing. So it doesn't actually have much in the way of real-world applications, you know, like most of the other songs we look at that talk about things like homelessness and domestic abuse and stuff like that. So this is more of a sort of more leaning towards fantasy, but it's a sort of ancient legend sort of thing, so there might be some truth in it, there might not, but it's, you know, that sort of thing. Anyway, so we'll jump into this track and see what we've got. I do have lyrics here, which I'm hoping are going to be accurate, but yeah, let's jump into this track and see what we've got. So we've got Melkin's Tale by Ghosts of Atlantis. Now, before we do that, if you can just take a moment to like and subscribe if you haven't already, it would really mean the world to me. You know, I've been doing this for about 7 years at this point, and not even 3% of people watching my videos are actually subscribed. So, you know, if you could like and subscribe, it doesn't cost you anything, it takes a fraction of a second, but it does make the biggest difference to me and the channel. So let's jump into this and see what we've got. Melkin's Tale by Ghosts of Atlantis. Let's have a look. an interesting start.
Side by side, ignored by the scholars that be. Intolerance, waiting for my space.
Nice. What a great piece of music that was. As expected with Ghosts of Atlantis, they've always put together some amazing pieces of music. Just the composition of the music itself, it's really catchy, it's really heavy, it's quite chunky sounding, but there's still that sort of almost ethereal sort of thing going on in the background, like whether it be keyboards or that sort of thing. And you got the big sort of chunky main riff, and then you've got the sort of higher pitched guitars putting the rhythm over the top of it. It sounds amazing, absolutely brilliant. Now, in most Ghost of Atlantis songs that we've had the harsh vocals done by Phil. He's always put down those deep sort of death metal growls. And normally at some point we've had a moment where we've had clean vocals put in by Colin. Now that hasn't really happened here, because, there's normally a sort of separate section. There's the harsh growls, then there's clean, then there's harsh, then there's clean, as it is, in most Ghost of Atlantis songs that we've heard. Now, there are clean vocals in this, but they are doubled with the harsh vocals as well, so there's no actual section of just clean vocals, which is quite different from most other Ghost of Atlantis tracks we've looked at. But it works because it adds that extra bit to around about the chorus, I think it is, that the clean vocals come in. Either way, it sounds like it's a great sounding piece of music. They never disappoint with their music, Ghosts of Atlantis. They've been consistently good in everything they've done. Granted, they haven't actually really been around that long. I can't even remember when 362... Was it 362 for? I know it was 4 numbers that made up the title of the first album. And I still don't know what those numbers mean, and it still really bothers me. But either way, when that album first came out, that must have been, 2, 3, maybe 4 years ago. So the actual band as a whole that we know of hasn't been around for that long. But they've never disappointed. They've always been consistently good. But then, there's quite the pedigree that goes behind it, with, members from Devilment being part of the band. Anyway. So we talked a little bit about Melkin at the beginning of the video and what the prophecy of Melkin was, involving the Holy Grail. And like I said, there's not really much I can possibly discern from this track, because as with all previous Ghost of Atlantis release, they've been concept albums. There's been one big overarching story telling the the whole tale throughout the album. So, this is just one slice from an album called Melkin's Tale. So, the lyrics go: entombed in the dark, 2 vessels side by side, ignored by the scholars that be, laid to rest with 2 fork lines placed beneath. Forever in perpetual sleep. Here marble surrounds the tomb of fallen knights. 104 here there be. For prophecies tell of a place etched in stone on whispers of truth and immortality. Now, I actually kind of wish I looked a bit further into this story, because here marble surrounds the tomb of fallen knights. 104 here there be. So that's obviously talking about a crypt containing the tombs of 104 fallen knights. Now, who are these knights? Because, it was suggested in what we spoke about before that Melkin was around before the time of Merlin. So, and then there was also the suggestion that it might have been sort of attributed to a similar sort of time as King Arthur. So, I mean, obviously this wouldn't be the Knights of the Round Table sort of thing, but, is there something before that I'm not aware of? So, he's talking about the tomb of these knights. Anyway, now chaos reigns, thy will be done, we're left forsaken by all. Can you hear the tale? Now can you hear the tale? Now, it says here, now can you hear the tale that Melkin sung? But that line there, the tale that Melkin sung, wasn't actually in the track that we looked at, unless it was said very, very quietly. The blood and the sweat lays encased by his side, this power from God so divine. For this island of dwellers we live in paradise, if they just claim that which lay deep inside. The Grail contains eternal life, heaven's dew, and its water for all. On the day of judgment, one day in Josaphat, then open these things that they should be. So, blood and sweat lays encased by his side. That sort of, the power of God so divine, for this island of dwellers we live in paradise. Now, that's Avalon. And if I remember correctly, Avalon, it's the legendary island featured in Arthurian tales, Avalon. But, I believe Avalon is actually a reference to possibly the UK. It's not a common thing, but it sort of gives that idea, because the whole idea of King Arthur and that sort of thing is supposed to have taken place, Glastonbury in England. That's a major part of the Arthurian legend. So is Avalon supposed to be the UK? I can't remember, because I know the UK used to be referred to as Albion as well, because there was the My Dying Bride tour Albion in Ruin, and that was, Albion was a reference to the UK. So is Albion perhaps a evolution of Avalon? Albion, Avalon, they do have a very similar sort of sound. So is that where Avalon is? Anyway, he said, from this island of dwellers, the island of Avalon, or what have you. If they just claim that which lays deep inside, this Grail contains eternal life. So, that whole myth that I spoke about at the beginning with, a hidden grave of Joseph of Arimathea in Glastonbury, England, that contains the Holy Grail. So, for this island of dwellers, they just claim what lays deep inside. So the Grail deep inside this apparent grave of Arimathea. This Grail contains eternal life, heaven's dew, and all that. So, it goes back into that chorus. When chaos reigns, thy will be done. We're left forsaken by all. Now can you hear the tale that Melkin sung? Now Jerusalem it wavers, as Avalon she screams, this power's unknown to all realms. It ripples, traverses, and passes through the realms, it shakes the very fabric of the times. All should listen and hearken, keep faith in his words, for the Holy Grail lays in wait for the one. Now listen, be still, and empty your thoughts, for only then will you hear the tale that Melkin sung. So again, keep faith in his words, for the Holy Grail lays in wait for the one. So the Grail is waiting for, waiting to be found, essentially. But it's waiting for a very specific sort of person, a person of particular quality, of purity, that sort of thing, possibly, to bring it back into the world. The Holy Grail is one of those things that pops up in so many sort of legends and things like that. Like, I'm obsessed with the Knights Templar, and bizarrely enough, I got that obsession through playing video games. And they say video games don't teach you anything. Anyway, I became obsessed with the Knights Templar, and Alexa, stop. Sorry about that. Anyway, I became obsessed with the Knights Templar, and learning about the sort of things, and, they were supposed to be the guardians of the Holy Grail. So, does this sort of tie in with the Knights Templar? I don't know. Because, the whole idea was, with this, is that the Holy Grail is buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. But is also suggesting that it's in Avalon. And Avalon, I'm pretty sure, isn't in Jerusalem. I could be completely wrong. Might be getting my all my things mixed up here. But also, this is a time way before the Knights Templar. Hold on, when was this? Mid-14th century, and the Knights Templar were... Actually, the Knights Templar were... They were 12th century, weren't they? I could be mistaken. Yeah, Knights Templar were 12th century. Ha! So, because I think it was 1360 something, I think, when the Templars got destroyed. So, is this the suggestion that the Grail has gone from where the Templars had held it to Joseph of Arimathea? I don't know. There's a whole lot of mixed things going on here. Anyway, it says, now listen, be still, and empty your thoughts, for only then will you hear. So, you've got to be at peace, you've got to be mindful before you, might find what you're looking for. And, to hear the tale that Melkin sung, you've got to listen intently to what's being said, what's being sung, what's being sort of portrayed. And, it should lead you to your final destination, this place that you're looking for. When chaos reigns, thy will be done. We're left forsaken by all. Now can you hear the tale of prophecies undone? So there's a slight variation in the chorus there. So it ends with of prophecies undone rather than the tale that Melkin sung. Now Melkin feels the cold as it rises up his spine. The truth of the Grail now entwines. The kingdoms lay in wait, for the truth will now behold, as light reflects off lands that once were cold, and chalices of gold. Again, the reference to the Holy Grail. And this is something that was actually... This is another sort of point of contention with the Holy Grail, because there have been so many different arguments about what it could possibly be. If you look at... And I know I'm going into works of fiction here. If you look at things like Indiana Jones, the whole idea of the Holy Grail is supposed to be the cup from which Jesus drank. That's if you believe in such things. So the idea of it being a gold bejeweled chalice doesn't quite fit. Again, this is looking at the Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones theory, because Jesus was a humble person. He was nothing. He was a carpenter, basically. So he wouldn't have some big, extravagant, bejeweled chalice. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, it was a small wooden cup. There's also the suggestion, if you look at things like, and I'm probably going to get a lot of ribbing for this, if you look at things like the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, there's the suggestion that the Holy Grail itself wasn't actually a cup at all. It was suggested that the Holy Grail was possibly the womb of a woman. It is a place that gives life. And the idea of the Grail is it gives life. And they go through all the symbology in the book and anything like that. A lot of people talk about it saying it's a load of bollocks, and I think religion as a whole is a load of bollocks, but people still follow that religiously, so why can't I talk about works of fiction? Anyway, there is a large debate still about what exactly the Grail is, and personally I still think actually more likely that the idea that it wouldn't be this big golden bejeweled cup makes sense. If this was supposedly the cup from which Jesus drank, it really wouldn't be this big, ostentatious golden chalice bedecked with jewels. It kind of makes sense. But anyway, it's the way treasure hunters think. Automatically they think something interesting is going to be found. It must be worth lots, and as such, it must be gold or jewels. It's not always the way. Anyway, went a bit off topic there. So what was I saying? The kingdom lay in wait, for the truth will now behold, as light reflects off lands that once were cold, and chalices of gold. So, they lay in wait for the discovery of this legendary treasure, as it were. Now chaos reigns, thy will be done. We're left forsaken by all. Now can you hear the tale of prophecies undone? Now chaos reigns, thy will be done. We're left forsaken by all. Now can you hear the tale of prophecies undone? Now can you hear the tale that Melkin sung? And that's that. So, excuse me. This is talking about the prophecy of Melkin, that text that allegedly reveals the grave of Joseph of Arimathea in Glastonbury, England, which contains the Holy Grail. Now, it says here, 2 vessels side by side. So there's a suggestion that there are 2 things to choose from. And again, this comes down to one of those lines that we saw earlier, and I can't remember what it was. That it's waiting for the Holy Grail lays in wait for the right one. So is there two, and you have to choose the right one out of the two that are sitting there. And again, that leads back to like the whole Indiana Jones sort of thing. Are you going to choose the big ostentatious gold jewel encrusted one, or are you going to choose the simple little cup, probably carved from wood? Are you going to be greedy, or are you going to be humble? And you've got to be of the right sort of mentality. You've got to be sort of pure in heart, innocent, not greedy. So are you choosing the big ostentatious thing because you want the shiny? Or are you thinking, logically and going, well, if he was a humble, if Jesus, if he ever existed, was a humble person, would he really have something like that, or would he have the simple thing? So, they allude more than once to there being two vessels. So, there is that sort of choice. Could they both possibly be the Holy Grail? But does it matter in the state of your mind? Does it matter what's in your heart as to the results that happen once you make your selection? Are you choosing the big gold ostentatious thing because you think that Jesus, again, if he existed, was a king and worthy of such, amazing, beautiful things? Is that why you picked the gold one? Or are you picking the gold one because it's shiny, it's worth a lot of money? Are you picking the small wooden one because because Jesus, again, if he existed, was a humble carpenter? And, that would more likely be. Are you picking that because it seems the most logical choice? Or, are you picking that because you're not greedy? Are you picking that because, it just seems more logical? There's a lot to dig into here with like the idea of holy grails and stuff like that, and most of my knowledge of it comes from what I've read about the Knights Templar and things that have covered it in film, and whether you like it or not, some of them do make an interesting sort of thought exercise. Would it be that big gold ostentatious thing? Would it be a small, humble wood or possibly clay cup? What is it? Could it also possibly be, as suggested, and like I said, I know Dan Brown is often mocked and stuff like that, but could it also be interpreted as, the life-giving capabilities of a woman's womb? Because it's one of those things there's a suggestion that it's never actually been depicted in paintings or anything like that. So, whatever. But, this is... It's telling an interesting story, and, I want to find out what the rest of the story is, because, like I said, this is bound to be part of a bigger concept album. I mean, the actual album itself is called Melkin's Tale, so it's going to be more than just this one part. Unless it's just a one-track EP or a single. Either way, there's bound to be a larger overarching story talking about the rest of the adventure to find this, probably. So, I'd like to look further into it. And like I said before, it's another exceptionally good piece of music by Ghost of Atlantis. But then, what did we really expect? They actually played at Bloodstock this year. I didn't go. Which is... it's a shame, because I would have liked to have seen that, because they are a great band. But anyway, I'm just talking absolute bollocks now. Great piece of music, brilliantly executed, as always. Like I said at the beginning, they've been consistently good in the music that they put out. Most of the music is based around folklore and legends and stuff like that. So, I find it interesting, because obviously they have to do a lot of research to write these things. And I've mentioned in other videos where I've talked about bands that do this, I have the utmost respect for that, because to be able to write the songs, you first have to do a lot of research, and you have to sort of get it in order, because all too often with things like legends and, folklore and stuff like that, there's a lot of conflicting accounts, you know, like I said before, you know, where I was talking about the Knights Templar, you know, the Holy Knights of Jerusalem was supposed to be in possession of the Holy Grail. They were the protectors of the Holy Grail. But there's also this one here, that there is a grave somewhere of Joseph Arimathea who has the Holy Grail. So, you know, there's sort of conflicting accounts of what is and what isn't true. But again, you know, the same could be said with things like religion. You know, there's different accounts of what really happened. You know, so you've got to research it, try and make sense out of it, decide which path you're going to go with, possibly even merge the two if you can make sense of it and make them fit, you know. So you've got to do all that research first of all, but then you've got to be able to write songs for it, make them coherent, make them make sense, and tell the story at the same time. So, you know, I always find it very impressive when artists do this. It's very difficult to do. So there is that as well. But anyway, like I said, I'm just waffling now. But, you know, great piece of music. Absolutely loved it. Look forward to the rest of that album when it comes out, if that is indeed an entire album. So, yeah, I don't really know what else I can say on that, so I'm going to leave that as it is. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like or a subscribe if you haven't already. It would really, really mean the world to me. You know, I've been doing this for about 7 years at this point, and not even 3% of people watching my videos are actually subscribed, which is a little bit disappointing, you know, because I like to think I do something quite different than most other reactors. You know, most reactors will look at a song and go, yeah, I like it, no, I didn't, and that's normally about all you'll get. You know, there's very few, if any, other reactors out there that will actually delve into and talk about what the song itself is about, you know, and I think that's an important part of looking at a piece of music. You know, I want to react to the actual song. You know, what is the story that's being portrayed? What are the themes, the morals, you know, what is the song about? You know, it's all very well just listening to it and going, yeah, it's good, but, you know, what is the story, what is the song trying to tell you? You know, is it talking about things like domestic violence or mental health issues? Is it talking about homelessness? You know, is it talking about the corruption of governments, you know, and the suffering of the normal people? You know, what are the tales that it's telling? You know, because heavy metal is often misinterpreted and, you know, often thought of as being violent and aggressive and about murder and sacrifice, which is far from the truth. You know, I've covered close to 900 songs on this channel, and most of them have had a real-world story being told, whether it be about domestic violence, homeless veterans, you know, mental health, depression, anxiety, that sort of thing. You know, a lot of the songs I've looked at have covered those sort of subjects, and that's not really something you find all that much in things like popular music, you know. So I want to dispel that sort of misconception that heavy metal is all about murder and evil and stuff like that. You know, sometimes it's telling a story from legend, you know, which is, you know, that's fascinating to me. That's something that really, really interests me. You know, it might be talking about real world things that really need to be discussed, you know, because things like depression and homelessness are greatly misunderstood. They're seen as taboo subjects that people feel really uncomfortable talking about, but they need to be discussed. You know, and that's why I do what I do the way I do it, you know, because, like I said, most people look at a song and go, yeah, it was good, no, it wasn't, and that's normally about all you get. You know, I want to discuss the meanings within the song. What does it mean to me? What does it mean to you? You know, I want to have that conversation. And that's why I do what I do the way I do it, you know, and I thought people might find that interesting. So, you know, if you could like and subscribe, it would really, really help me out. It doesn't cost you anything. It takes a fraction of a second, but it does make the biggest difference to me and to the channel. But anyway, that's about all I've got for you for this video. Thank you all very, very much for watching, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.